Hello everybody, my name is Michael with Retro Revive Repairs, and today we have a original Game Boy DMG-01. This was the first Game Boy Nintendo ever released in 1989, and was one of the first handhelds, if not the first handheld, to hit the consumer market. So, giving it a quick glance over, I can already see it is pretty yellowed, compared to the back, which you can see is still kind of its gray color. The front is very yellowed. I believe it has been sitting in someone's attic in the sun for a long time, and I'm unsure if it works. But we're going to put some batteries in it and find out. The buttons feel okay, could probably use some new membranes. I'm not sure if you can see that. The select button is it has a chunk missing out of it, so that'll need to be replaced. I'm probably not going to retro bright this case because I have some spares and I'm just not 100% sure on retro brighting yet. I've heard it can brittle the plastic and get rid of some of the stickers or logos here that are painted on, which I'm not 100% sure I want to do. So I do have a spare case on hand if I decide I want to replace this, which I probably will. But first, let's decide on if it even works. All right, so it looks like we do have a power on, and it looks to me like the screen is in great condition. Let's test out the sound here. So it looks to me like this Game Boy is actually fully functional. However, it is in need of just a bit of a tune-up. This isn't the worst shape one I've seen, and it's great that it still works because I do like using original parts when I can. So, we are going to get started. Alright, so what I've decided I'm going to do with this console is we are going to replace the shell first with this one. As you can see, there is a huge difference between the color on this one and the color on this one. This is a Retro 6 shell. I am not sponsored by them, but I do believe that they make great shells for these consoles. I'm also going to be replacing the button membranes, the buttons, the speaker, as well as all the capacitors inside the console. This should give it a good refresh while still using enough of the original components to make me comfortable. So we're going to get started with a Y-wing screwdriver bit. There are 6 Y-wing screws on this console. You need to take the cartridge out. 6 Y-wing screws on this console here, 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 and here. We're going to get those removed, and then the console will split in half, and I will get back to you then. Alright, so now that we've got all of the screws out, we are going to split it along the seam like this. It comes apart very easily. However, it is still connected, as you can see, by this ribbon cable that holds the front plate onto the back plate. So what we're going to do is we're going to very gently take our finger like this and pull down all at once to remove the 2 sides. The ribbon cable is very sturdy, but make sure you're still gentle with it so that way we don't break anything. So right off the bat, it looks to me like we do have a bit of dirt. I can't tell if that's capacitor leaking or if that's just dirt. Let me get a closer look at it. I'm not 100% sure, but it looks to me like this side of the board is pretty dirty and could do with a capacitor replacement. But overall, it looks in decent enough condition. This speaker is going to be replaced with a higher quality one. The power board over here is the standard model, and what we're going to do is we're going to start with a recap first because it requires us to take all of these components out. So how we're going to do this is we're going to take both of these boards out, and then when we put them back in, we are going to put them in our new case instead of the old case. So we're going to start with the power board first. The power board is on the back side with the battery springs. There are 2 screws that hold the main board in here, and there are 2 screws that hold the power jack. This entire assembly is all wired together, so it all comes out as one piece, but there are wires that connect these 2 together, so it's all got to come out at once. So we're going to remove these 2 screws, which are Phillips instead of tri-wing. So switch to your Phillips bit for that. And then the entire board should come out like this. Now, like I said, it is still connected here, so we need to remove these screws as well, which are also Phillips. And once we get those out, we should be able to remove the entire board from the back housing. So here we have the original board. Now, it is pretty dirty looking at it for the first time. We have some dirt here, as well as some dirt on this wheel, which I did when I picked it up. I felt this felt a little stiff. Maybe it just needs some playing around with to get it running again. However, the cartridge slot, which is here, does look in decent enough condition, but I will be cleaning it as well just to give it a better chance at continue working in the future. The power switch itself looks in good enough condition, so we are going to get started with our recap. All right, so now that we have all the parts we need to refurbish this console, we are going to get started. There are 6 capacitors on the main board here, as well as 1 on the power regulator and 2 on the headphone jack and amplifier board. The battery springs don't look like they need to be replaced, so I'm going to be leaving those intact. However, I will be recapping this entire console. Now, as I do this, I'm going to have a picture of the board up with the capacitor highlighted on which one I am replacing, as well as its values, as well as, before I begin this, I'm going to have a list of all the capacitors you need right here, and we are going to get started. So I am on this capacitor right here, and I just thought of something small that I would share. When you're replacing capacitors, you want to make sure that you are keeping polarity in mind, especially with electrolytic capacitors, which these are. So, polarity is defined as a positive and a negative side. On these capacitors, you have the stripe here, which corresponds to, the majority of the time, it is the shorter leg on these leads. However, this stripe corresponds to this lead, and this lead is the negative side of the capacitor. Now, on most boards, you're going to see a negative side labeled, like right here. However, some boards do not label them, so you want to make sure you are paying attention before you pull them out. Otherwise, you're going to have to look up a schematic, which is not fun for anybody. Alright, so now with the main board recapped, we are going to continue on to the headphone jack and the main power board. There are only 3 capacitors left here, so I'm going to get that done real quick and I will get back to you. Something to note on this capacitor, like I said previously, there are no positive and negative markings on this one. So the best way I can remember this is it is currently, the negative side is currently facing up. So that is how I'm going to reinstall it. Do not reinstall it the other way, otherwise you may have some problems. I like to take a bit of 91% isopropyl alcohol on a cotton swab and just clean all the points where I have solder to clean off any flux or anything else that I may have introduced while I was in there. Alright, so we're back with a fully recapped main board here. Like I said, I had to get a little creative with some of the capacitors here. I had to put this one a little closer to these chips than I would have liked, and I also had to maneuver this one to where it would fit in the case. But overall, I am happy with my work. Make sure you look over your solder joints to make sure there's nothing cold or shorted before you install it back in the case. Now, I always like to make sure whenever I am doing work like this, that whenever I do a section of the board or anything major like a recap, that I test the section that I have been working on with the section that I have not been working on to make sure there are no faults here before I move on to this part. So that way if there's a fault here or I run into an issue later, that I know where the issue lies rather than having to backtrack all the way. So what we're just going to do really quick is reinstall this ribbon cable. And put it back together quite precariously, but just enough to where it will work. So we're going to install some batteries in it real quick. I'm not even going to put a game in it. I'm just going to make sure it turns on. And as I mentioned, as I can see, I actually didn't put the power switch in. So we are going to use this cotton swab to do the power switch. No, we're not. We're going to use the power switch to flip the power switch. All right, so looks to me like everything is working. So we are going to go ahead and move on to the main screen itself. All right, so there are 10 screws that hold this board in. The speaker is not held in with anything, it just sits in there. However, there is a bit of adhesive that holds this front screen on as well. We're going to have to loosen that a little bit, but after we get these 10 screws out, it should come out fairly easily. All right, so now that we have this out, we should be able to just gently pull this up and out. Like I said, there is a bit of adhesive that holds this screen in, but with a little bit of gentle pressure, it should release. The adhesive is pretty old. Okay, so now that we have, ooh, that speaker's rough. Okay, now that we have this out, we can see the old button membranes, which are not in too shabby of shape, but this screen has a bit of dirt on it that I will clean off when I am finished. So we are going to begin replacing the capacitors on this board for the screen. I'm going to go ahead and desolder the speaker wires here so that way I don't have to drag this thing around with me. All right, so now that we've got the speaker removed, we are going to go ahead and move on with the capacitor replacement. Very straightforward, just remove the capacitors and install the new ones. However, on these here, I take a bit of a different route. I find that disrupting this ribbon cable is quite difficult and can result in damage in some cases. So what I actually end up doing is I cut these leads. I cut the leads on the focus, there we go. I cut the leads that are on these capacitors. I install these very small SMD ceramic capacitors in place. I leave the leads where they are. But I just remove the capacitor and then install these new capacitors in where the leads were. I will show that in a little bit further depth in a moment, but that is how I do it. So now we are going to get started with these. I apologize for the poor camera quality, but we are going to get started with these single microfarad 50 volt capacitors. So like I said, what I'm going to do is I am going to cut the leads right here at the base of the capacitor, and then I am going to solder in a surface mount device ceramic capacitor in its place. So here's what I'm doing. This one is soldered, not the best job in my opinion, but I will clean it up a little bit later. So as you can see, the leads are still in place, and I have placed this capacitor in between the two of them, and now we are going to solder it in place. Using the tiniest amount of solder possible. And it's already moving. Great. Should have used some tweezers to hold this in place. There we go. And now we have the opposite side, which we are going to apply just a little bit of solder there. And we should be good. So now we're going to do this 3 more times, and we are done. Alright, so now that we have both the main board and the screen board recapped, we are going to move on to the fun part, installing a new shell. Now, this is a Retro 6 shell. They feel very high quality, but unfortunately there is no Game Boy logo here, which is a little disappointing, but I understand why they probably could not do that. Comes with all the screws we need, as well as a Game Link port cover. So what I do first is we are going to get our buttons. We have some brand new buttons that we are also going to install. I believe these are also made by Retro 6, but don't quote me on that. These also feel quite nice, but I also have a saying that nothing beats the original. So now with our refurbished motherboard, we are going to go ahead and install this into our shell. Now, one thing you want to make sure you do when you install this is that these wires here need to go beside this screw post. You don't want to screw into the wires. So I just make sure I gently push them out of the way, and they will sit in place. We're going to go ahead and clean this power switch just a little bit so that way it looks nice when we reinstall it in our console. I am not sure if Retro 6 provided one for me, however, I may have very well just lost it. Now, what I like to do with this ribbon cable, whenever I reinstall it, is I like to get a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on a Q-tip and just ever so gently rub it on the contacts of this, so that way we can get them a little clean, because sometimes they get a little dirty, and this just helps the console out in the long run. All right, so now that we have everything back together, we are going to go ahead and install our screen lens. This is not plastic like the original, this is actually glass. The listing claims tempered glass, but I have not personally tested that myself. All right, so now that we have everything back together, minus the screws, we're going to see how it looks. It feels quite nice. Looks like the buttons are nice and responsive. That is the problem I find is the biggest when I refurbish these consoles, is the start button doesn't work, so that is good that it is working quite wonderfully. All right, so this console is playing great and working great. So now we are going to put the back screws in, and we can wrap this up. I can make sure this console is in perfect condition because, like I said on my website, every console that leaves my bench undergoes at least 2 hours of testing before it is sent out. There we go. But I believe this console should pass that test no problem. The speaker sounds much better than it did when we got it in. And I think this console looks absolutely wonderful. Let me turn up the contrast for you guys. So that's it for this episode. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you'd like to purchase this console, it will be for sale in my website, which you can find in the description or at retroreviverepair.com. Make sure to check out my social media for updates on behind the scenes and anything else I can think of posting. Also, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give me a follow and like the video as well. I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.